Certain sequels have the unique ability to take something already incredible and add that little extra touch to perfect it. Today we're going to look at a few of those sequels in the medium of video games, all of which have enormous potential, but one in particular stands above the rest. So grab some snacks. We're going to see how these sequels could change the world. Potential is just such an exciting idea. It's something I think about a lot. When you see a first draft pick in the NBA, you get excited because you understand the potential of what they could accomplish. What will their career be like? How many championships will they win? When a new IP releases from a developer you like, you get thrilled knowing what that game could be like. Look at Silksong. Why do people care about this game? It's not like it's ever going to come out. Sorry, that's mean. People care about this game for a simple reason. They care because of the potential that it has. What kind of bosses, what kind of abilities will you unlock? What will the music be like? Why do people hit that subscribe button? It's because they're excited about the potential classic that I'll drop. Potential is exactly what this video is all about. There are certain games whose sequels could become one of the best games of all time. So where better to begin than with a sequel coming out next year? A sequel to a game that changed the gaming landscape back in 2017. It reinvented what it means to be an open world game. Not only that, but it won countless awards and, yeah, you get it, it's Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild came out and instantly took the gaming world by storm, receiving 10 out of 10s from every gaming outlet under the sun. And while I think this game is fantastic, I don't know if I agree with these perfect ratings. Now granted, a 10 out of 10 doesn't necessarily mean a game has no flaws, simply that the game's positives are so overwhelming that there's no real point in mentioning the negatives. At least, that's how I see it. Now, just so we're clear, I love this game. It is one of my favorite games of all time, but its flaws are not so minuscule that they're not worth mentioning. However, I do believe that the flaws in Breath of the Wild are less, this is the worst part of this game and this is why it's bad, and more, if this was here, the game would be so much better. Breath of the Wild feels like a great pizza with no toppings. It's still good, and nobody's gonna turn down a good pizza, but you could elevate it to a totally different level if you just put some toppings on it, you know? If Breath of the Wild's sequel made a few small additions to the world and changes to the combat, it would be one of the greatest video games of all time. Now, there are thousands of videos on YouTube that talk at length about how good this open world is, and honestly I don't really disagree with them. But I do think it could be substantially better. First and most obvious are the dungeons. Now, I disagree with the idea that the world of Breath of the Wild is empty. There are 8 different towns, 4 different dungeons, and each town has its own unique aesthetic. Goron City is a lava-filled mining town, while Rito Village is built around this spire, a verticality that perfectly suits the Rito that live there. These towns are all unique and diverse, and they each have their own unique music themes too, my personal favorite being Rito Village. The towns in this game are genuinely fantastic, and they're a phenomenal contrast to the quiet, isolated feeling you get from exploring the world. Then, of course, you have the dungeons. These dungeons themselves are a bit of a mixed bag. Personally, I liked them, but they don't do a very good job of standing next to the open world. All I could think about while in these dungeons was how badly I wanted to go back out and explore the world again. The other issue here is that the dungeons are in the towns. This means that while there are technically 12 major landmarks, 4 of them are in the same place as 4 others. Once you found Rito Village, you also find the Rito dungeon. So really there are only 8 things to interact with. Technically 9 if you include Hyrule Castle, 10 if you include the Lost Woods. We're getting off topic. That's not even my biggest issue. The dungeons being in the same place as the villages really isn't a big deal. The biggest issue is that the dungeons aren't engaging enough. Let's look at the dungeons in Crosscode. When in these dungeons, all I can think about are the dungeons. This is because of the challenges the dungeons present you with. They're constantly adding on to previous ideas and providing unique challenges. It's hard not to focus on the dungeons when they're this good. If Breath of the Wild's dungeons were more like this, they'd be far more fun to complete. Of course, there's also the idea that dungeons should be scattered across the world, not just limited to towns, and I totally agree with this. Now, of course, when we talk about Zelda dungeons, we also have to talk about items. I feel as though this is one of the biggest missed opportunities in Breath of the Wild. I loved the champion powers, 2 of them even added to the gameplay. But it could be so much better than that. You see, I recently played Metroid Dread. This game reminded me of how much fun it is to gain upgrades that make traversing the world way easier and more fun. I mean, just look at the difference in movement in the beginning of Dread compared to the end of it. Now imagine what Breath of the Wild would be like if it had something like this. Maybe you could get a single hookshot like an Ocarina of Time that lets you instantly scale small walls and get a head start on larger ones. This is effectively what Rivali's Gale does, But we can go a step further by adding a double claw shot like from Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword. Now you can fly up mountains with ease. Of course, this would have to be a late game item as it basically trivializes climbing for the rest of the game, but it would be a nice reward for getting that far into the game. Maybe even lock the double claw shot behind a super hard secret dungeon, so to gain this crazy new ability you have to work for it. But it's not just traversal. In Metroid Dread you also get new combat abilities. These would be wonderful in Breath of the Wild. Once again, a champion's power, or Boss's Fury, technically acts as an addition to combat, but it's just one ability. You could do so much more than this, like a boomerang to stun enemies, or spells like in Skyrim that you can unlock via side quests or dungeons. So the biggest issue with Breath of the Wild's open world isn't that it has nothing, it's that it could have so much more. Now there's also the combat. Breath of the Wild's combat is fine, but just like the open world, it could be so much better. Obviously this game needs more enemies, this is a given. There are 6 enemy types in this game? I'm very confident this is something that will be improved upon in the sequel, and I really don't think there's much else to say about it. This game has some really fun combat, especially in the early hours of the game. First, let's deal with the elephant in the room. I'm actually okay with weapons breaking. I know, let me explain. Weapons breaking is a fine mechanic because it gives the game the ability to reward you with incredibly powerful weapons early on without ruining the combat. The combat doesn't break because the weapon does first. I think for this reason alone, weapons breaking is fine. However, I don't think the system is perfect, and if Nintendo was able to find a different system to replace it, I'd 100% be on board. So allow me, as the final authority on the subject, to propose a perfect solution. In Metroid Dread, look, I promise I won't mention this game again, you get this temporary upgrade that allows you to defeat certain enemies. So what if, in Breath of the Wild, upon defeating a super powerful enemy that you weren't really supposed to beat, Link gains temporary buffs to the weapon he used to deal the final blow? Maybe something like 40 hits. Then the buff goes away and you're back to normal damage. The other solution I can think of is making some special weapons breakable. So you go raid an enemy camp, grab a royal broadsword, and that specific one is, I don't know, like a damaged royal broadsword or something. And so it'll break after a certain amount of hits. Okay, with the broken part of this combat out of the way, let's talk about the actual issues. As I mentioned in the beginning, early on, Breath of the Wild has some super fun combat. The reason for this is because you can use your environment and the physics of the game to pull off some genuinely fun things. And all of it is effective. In the early game. As the game progresses and enemies gain more and more health, the usefulness of these techniques begins to fade very quickly. This is honestly pretty disappointing since the combat in the early hours of Breath of the Wild is honestly some of the most fun combat I've ever seen in a video game. So how do we fix this for the sequel? Well, it's easy. You just scale the damage of environmental hazards with the health bars of the enemies. A metal crate dropped on a bokoblin shouldn't do 10 damage, it should do some percentage of their health. A percentage number ensures that moves like this are always useful. But why stop there? Sword combat can be dramatically improved as well. Look at Twilight Princess for a great example of how this would work. In this game, Link gains new sword techniques as the game progresses. Imagine finding secret scrolls around the world that unlocked new abilities for Link to use in combat. Not only would it be another reason to explore, thereby strengthening the open world, but it would also add another layer of depth and player choice to the combat. If you're skilled enough, maybe you can use sword techniques to dispatch any enemy like some kind of samurai. Or maybe you want to take the Batman approach and set a ton of traps and use the environment to your advantage. Just these simple changes would dramatically improve the combat of Breath of the Wild. None of what I've listed here would really require overhauling an entire game. They're all small, simple changes that would impact the game in a dramatic way. That's all it takes to make Breath of the Wild 2 a sequel that would change the world. Now let's move on to the next game in this trilogy. Another fantastic game that released on the Switch in 2017. Odyssey is the most consistent game on this list, and as a result, it's the easiest and most simple game to fix. I think all it would take to make this game truly perfect is just taking what's already there and expanding on it. I really do think you have the groundwork for something great here. It's just not quite there yet. Mario Odyssey is the most fun video game I have ever played. It's not my favorite video game, and it's not the best game I've ever played, but I've never had so much pure concentrated fun. A large part of this is the total lack of stress due to the game's difficulty, or rather lack thereof. I went over difficulty in my Metroid Dread video, but if you haven't seen it, which you should after this one, here's a quick summary. Difficulty matters relative to the atmosphere of the game. If a game is all about overcoming impossible odds, it should be a hard game, while if a game is just about relaxing, it's okay for it to be easy. So in Mario Odyssey, the game is all about traveling the globe and saving the princess. The main idea is for this game to be a globe-trotting adventure. It's kind of in the name. So the question, of course, is, should it be difficult? Well, what if I told you it doesn't matter? Now look, could the game be improved a bit by making it harder? Well, sure it could. But all I think it would take is just improving what's already there. We'll start with the movement. The movement in this game is so much fun. It makes you feel like you're a speedrunner, and I love how momentum works in this game. The freedom of movement as well is incredible, and with the help of Cappy, you can sneak your way into places that you don't really feel like you should be able to get to. It's always fun to see just how far you can get without captures. Just moving around in the game is that much fun. Cappy simply adds on to the already varied movement to make what is, in my opinion, the best movement of a 3D Mario game. But how do we make it even better? Well, let's start by looking at Super Mario Galaxy. In Galaxy, each type of jump feels distinct, whereas in Odyssey, the alternate jumps lack that feeling of significance. In Odyssey, it feels like all you really need is the triple jump and maybe the side flip. The long jump especially feels useless when compared to Mario 64 in Galaxy. Just a small adjustment to make the long jump go a little bit further or the backflip go a little higher. Small things like this would go a long way. Next are the levels. The levels are designed in a brilliant way. Check this desert boss out. In the beginning of this desert stage, you're introduced to the bullet bill capture. Using it, you can fly around and press Y to speed up. You learn exactly how this system works because there are a few moons that utilize it. And the more you explore, the more you understand about exactly how the bullet bill capture works. The boss in this area takes advantage of this perfectly. Its hands work just like bullet bills, and you use them to dodge ice blocks and hit him. This is genuinely masterful game design. You go from using these bullet bills in open areas, to more confined environments, to dodging environmental hazards, to finally a boss that throws ice blocks at you. Let's look at another example. In the Forest Kingdom, you're first introduced to these puddles of poison in a safe area. Shortly afterwards, you're introduced to piranha plants that can spit that poison at you. You defeat them by throwing Cappy and follow up by jumping on their head. Finally, you're faced with the boss of the level who asks you to dodge his poison attacks, throw Cappy at him, and, you guessed it, bounce on his head. It's another perfect progression of a concept. There are also plenty of really fun moons in this game. Look at this one in the forest level. You have to get through this little mini platforming gauntlet, and upon completing it, you grab yourself a moon. This is the perfect sort of challenge for a moon. It takes about a minute to get, and you have to do a little bit of platforming to get it. This is kind of what every single moon in the game should be like. The problem is that some moons are a bit too simple and easy to get. Now, just to be clear, that doesn't mean any simple moon is inherently bad. There are plenty of moons in this game that require a ground pound or a cannonball in the right place, but the difference is that these moons are hidden. So it's fine that they're simple to get. The challenge is figuring out where they are. Now, the solution to the problem of those simple moons out in the open is actually pretty simple, and it's something the game partially does already. Just put purple coins there instead. Purple coins are super useful when it comes to buying area-specific items and outfits, so a player is never really going to be upset at finding them. This does technically raise the problem of having too many purple coins, but the solution to that is simple as well. You can remove certain purple coins that just sit out in the open and replace them with those hidden purple coins. Now we have the same amount of purple coins, and you actually have to do something to find them instead of just climbing a tree. Alternatively, if you really wanted to, you could just remove these moons from the game and move on, but that's not as fun of a solution in my opinion. Although some of them can definitely go. So like I said, this game is pretty easy to fix. It's just a few small things that could be a bit better. A few extra odds and ends that don't really need to be there. But the next game is a bit more flawed. However, its potential is unmatched. Xenoblade 3 has the most potential of all of the games on this list. I'm fairly confident that Monolith has a masterpiece on their hands with this game. The reason this sequel... Wait, isn't it the third game? The... threequel? Is that a thing? Hang on. What kind of Xenoblade 2 has such incredible potential because Monolith has proven the heights that they're able to reach individually in each game. All they need to do is put all of that together into one single game. Let's talk about what it does right first, starting with the combat. The combat of Xenoblade 2 seems complicated at first, and in all fairness, I will admit it's not like Breath of the Wild where you can just pick up the game and figure out how to fight within 2 minutes. This combat takes a lot of knowledge and practice, but upon learning how it works, it is the best combat of any JRPG I've played. This combat is so much fun because as the fight goes on, what you do in combat changes as well. It comes down to 4 stages: auto attacks, arts, specials, and blade combos. So let's start with the first level. Your character will automatically attack when close enough to an enemy. They always attack in a certain pattern, and that pattern changes based on the character and weapon you're using. This rhythm matters a lot because of the next stage of combat, arts. On the bottom right of the screen, you have these arts. They deal far more damage than auto attacks, but they have cooldown. You can't use an art until you've landed enough auto attacks. Now that rhythm I mentioned before is important here because when you use an art just as an auto attack ends, you cancel the animation of the auto attack and fill your special gauge much faster than had you used it without canceling. Speaking of specials, that's the next stage of combat. Once you've used enough arts, you can use a special attack which, you guessed it, deals even more damage than arts. Are you starting to see the pattern here? Each stage leads into the next, and each time you go on to the next stage, you can deal even more damage. Alright, back to specials. Each one has a level ranging from 1 to 4. These levels are super important as they not only allow you to deal more damage with each progressive level, but they also lead straight into the 4th and final stage of combat. You fight as a team in Xenoblade 2, and as you all use your special moves, you build up this thing in the top right. At the final level, you get a cutscene and tremendous damage. Now, granted, what I told you is a total oversimplification of the combat, but I don't want 40 minutes of this video to be dedicated exclusively to the combat of one of 3 games. Now let's talk about the flaws. I know I said this game is incredible, and really it is, but it has some major issues, most of which deal with the game itself. By the post-game, there's no argument that this is the best combat of any JRPG. In fact, maybe even one of the best combat systems in any game. But that's the big issue here. This game is, 80 hours long? It actually poses a really interesting question on whether or not you can even call a combat system like this good when the first 80 hours aren't. But that's a question for another video. This is the easiest problem in the entire video to solve, so I'm not complaining. It's simple, just let the player unlock things earlier. There's an ability in this game that allows you to cancel arts into other arts. Cool, right? Well, yeah, but you have to unlock it, and that can take a while. Next, speed up the rates at which arts and specials charge. You can already do this in-game with pouch items, but here's the thing about that. Why would you ever not use pouch items? Listen, I know it sounds like my argument is backwards right now, but hear me out. My favorite example of this can be found in Monster Hunter. You see, in Monster Hunter, there were these hot and cold areas where you had to use a hot or a cold drink to prevent your HP and stamina from draining. So here's the problem. Hot and cold drinks aren't hard to get, nor are they hard to use. They're an item you'll always use when the situation calls for it. So why are they in the game? What do they actually add? Well, Capcom came to the conclusion that the answer to that was nothing, and in Monster Hunter Rise, they finally removed them. I think pouch items are in a similar position. Once you find out what they do, you would never not use them. So why not just make their effects native? I think this would go a long way in just making the game feel better and less clunky, especially to newer players. So the gameplay, while a bit flawed, especially early on, is easily fixed. But what about the other half of the game? The story. Well, that's a bit more complicated. I've gone back and forth for a long time about which Xenoblade game I like the most. My conclusion is a bit messy, and maybe I'll make a full video on it one day, but all in all, I think I prefer 2. However, it's really not that simple. Xenoblade 1 is way more consistent than 2, but 2 has higher peaks than 1 does. To explain this, I'm gonna need to spoil a whole lot. So if you haven't played these games on screen, and have any intentions of doing so in the future, skip ahead to this timestamp on screen. Seriously, I am going to spoil the biggest twists in all of these games. You have been warned. Final disclaimer, I generally avoid talking about story and characters in my videos. This will probably be the last time I do it for a while. The reason for this is because I think they're both extremely subjective. But that's, again, a topic for another video. Just know all of this is just my opinion, and if you disagree, that's totally fine. So I think the perfect way to compare these two games is by looking at two of my favorite characters from these games, Shulk and Mythra. I think Mythra is a fantastic character, and I think she's probably the most interesting character in the series. But she suffers from being put in these painful trope situations that make it really hard to take her, and by extension the rest of the game, seriously. Mythra is a character that was brought into a world with the expectation that she would save it. Obviously, she doesn't really want to do this and is genuinely afraid of the power that she has. Her worst nightmares come true when she sinks Torna and by extension kills one of her friends. This breaks Mythra and she decides to create an alternate personality so she never has to wake up and deal with the horrible reality she's created. This painful truth is further confirmed in a few scenes from the game, in one of which she says,
"I didn't want to wake up. I didn't want to come back."
Mythra was so ruined from her experiences in Torna that she genuinely doesn't want to live anymore. A character who accidentally fulfilled the nightmare scenario of hurting the people they were supposed to protect is honestly one of the most interesting ideas I've seen for a character. But again, the problem is she's in scenes like this.
"You were staring.
Huh?
Pervert."
This creates an awful dissonance for cheap laughs, and it's genuinely disappointing and frustrating that it happens like this. Shulk, on the other hand, is relatively serious throughout his entire game. I don't think he's as interesting as Mythra, it's a typical revenge plot, but he still never falters. Shulk is just as fantastic here
I'll kill you!
as he is here.
What's important isn't whether you can see the future or not. It's the will to make a choice, and the strength to seize your destiny. Our time has come. Our destiny is our own!
So what if we combined the two? What if we had a character with the writing of Mythra and the consistency of Shulk? The story is just like this too. Again, Xenoblade 2 falters in these awful trope scenes, but it also has scenes where God explains how he remade the world that he accidentally destroyed, only for it to have the exact same problems that wiped it out once before. The feeling this cutscene instills is unlike any cutscene from any game. Better yet, it's unlike any scene from any movie, and personally is only topped by one scene from a book I read a few years back. The simple fact is that if you took everything Xenoblade 1 did right and combined it with everything Xenoblade 2 did right, you'd have one of the best games ever made. A game that not only has a story that's incredible from start to finish, but exceptional characters and even fantastic combat. These games are like two puzzle pieces. While separate, they're broken and incoherent, but together they could make something truly beautiful. Hey, editor's note, that just sounded really good in writing. I don't actually think Xenoblade 1 and 2 are broken, incoherent games, if that wasn't already obvious. Anyway, we've got a video to wrap up. You can think about sequels in a lot of ways. Maybe a sequel is a natural continuation of a story, or maybe it's an extension of what's already there. Those are totally valid ways of looking at a sequel, but to me, a sequel is a second chance. A chance to right the wrongs of their predecessors, a chance to patch the holes and fix what was nearly there but didn't quite reach the mark. A sequel gives creators the opportunity to truly fulfill their vision and improve based on what the world thought of their creation. It's okay that Breath of the Wild had a less than perfect world with subpar combat, because with the sequel, the Zelda team has a chance to make it right. It doesn't matter that Odyssey, while nearly perfect, is still lacking in key aspects that previous Mario games mastered, because Nintendo has a chance to fix those issues. It's okay that Xenoblade 2 in many ways failed to live up to the legacy of 1, because in plenty of ways it far surpasses 1, and proves that Monolith has a bright future with the next installment. The sequels in this video can fill in those missing pieces and complete the puzzle. And personally, I cannot wait to see the work of art that's revealed.